Mode. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I'm Shivendra, and on behalf of HarperCollins and Harvard University Press, I welcome you all this evening to the inaugural session of our brand new initiative called The Lecture, to be delivered by Professor Ruth Harris on her definitive biography, Guru to the World, The Life and Legacy of Vivekananda. To commence the session, I would now like to invite Anand Padmanabhan, Chief Executive Officer, HarperCollins India, to the stage.
Thank you, Shiv. Thank you. I know you've been waiting, and I'll keep this quick. I want to begin by thanking Sunit Tandon, who's the director of the India Habitat Center. When I called and said we'd like to host it, he was the first one readily to say yes. Thank you, Sunit. Thank you for that. It's our 30th anniversary at HarperCollins. We believe in telling the best stories and finding the best possible readership for our books. But the one thing that has been constant, despite all the changes in everything that the world's seeing, is the passion with which our authors write their books, the love with the readers receive them, and the sheer joy we as publishers find in publishing them. Over the years, we've had the pleasure of publishing some of the finest writing from the subcontinent. It's not just writing, we also do photo books, and cookbooks, and everything else. And the biggest bestsellers in Indian publishing history. Our books have won phenomenal awards. We ourselves have been named Publisher of the Year several times. But nothing has meant to us more than the fact that millions of people read our books, and somewhere a book of ours might be making a difference to someone. As part of the 30th anniversary of the company, we were thinking about things that we could do to bring the greatest of ideas to Indian readership, and the lecture was conceived. And when we were sitting in the office planning who to partner with so that we can make this grand, I didn't think of anybody else than Harvard University Press, our long-term partner in literary crime, as it were. When I spoke to Sharmila and George that this is the idea, they readily agreed, and they said, fantastic, let's kick it off. I want to thank George Andrew, Director, Harvard University Press, and Sharmila Sen, who's here in the front row, Editorial Director of Harvard University Press, for making this happen. And the natural segue was which book and who. And we unanimously agreed that it had to be Ruth Harris's seminal book, Guru to the World, and her lecture on Swami Vivekananda. That's how this evening came to be. Vivekananda himself needs no introduction. Few thinkers have had so enduring an impact on both Eastern and Western life and inspired the likes of Freud, Gandhi, and Tagore. Blending science, religion, and politics, Vivekananda introduced Westerners to yoga and the universalist school of Hinduism called Vedanta. His teachings fostered a more tolerant form of mainstream spirituality in Europe and North America, and forever changed Western relationship to meditation and spirituality. I'm very much looking forward to the lecture. Delhi, London, Boston, Bombay, Supriya Nair, senior journalist, founder of 52.in, will also be in conversation with Ruth Harris after the lecture is over. We've all conspired to try and give you an evening where our understanding of the world is slightly better than what it was yesterday. I'd like to now welcome Sharmila Sen, Ruth's publisher and editorial director at Harvard University, to introduce the speaker. Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Anand. Thank you to Habitat for hosting this night. And I'm going to keep this pretty short because you're here to listen to Ruth Harris. And sometimes I know this can feel a little bit like you want the movie to begin, but you're kind of hearing, Yash Raj Presents with Red Chili Entertainment and also with media partners. So I don't want to be that person. I'll be very quick and say that we published Guru to the World a couple of months ago in the US and UK, and it's great to be able to bring Ruth Harris here to India, where at last someone can say Vivekananda needs no introduction. As the publisher, let me tell you, after quite a few months of introducing someone I think needs no introduction also to hundreds and hundreds of people, it's wonderful to be here where I think this book has a very special kind of readership. So Ruth has been already, discussing this book with audiences in Jaipur, at Ashoka. She's going to Kolkata, I know, after this. But Delhi is very, very special for us, so I'm really glad that all of you have made it on a long holiday weekend, and I'm going to introduce now Ruth Harris, who will give the lecture, and after that, Supriya Nair, who will be joining us on stage, will kind of kick off a conversation. We want to keep it very conversational. Supriya will kind of engage Ruth in some question and answers, and then we want to hear from you all. We want to hear your questions, and hopefully afterwards you can continue this in a more informal way out there, where Ruth will also be signing books. Ruth Harris is a senior research fellow at All Souls College at Oxford. She's the fellow of the British Academy and professor of European history. She is also the author of Lourdes and The Man on Devil's Island, which won the Wolfson Prize and the National Jewish Book Award. So I am going to now ask Ruth to come out and meet her audience.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming and so much for struggling through the traffic tonight. Today, I hope to give you something new, not completely new, but a bit new. And as Sharmila just said, when I'm asked to give talks on Vivekananda in Britain or the United States, I generally have to start off by saying who he was and then go on to talk about why he's important. It's simply wonderful not to have to do that throat clearing. But the underlying question remains nonetheless. The argument in my book is that Vivekananda must and should be seen as one of the seminal figures of the global 19th century. But the pattern of his fame does not in any way match that of his influence. Here, he's a household name. In the West, very few have even heard of him. Why this is the case goes to the heart of his life, his ideas, and his program. Today, I want to understand why such different publics as respectable New Englanders and Swadeshi terrorists honored him so fervently. With the title of my book, Guru to the World, I did not want to reinforce the tired story of Vivekananda as the first global guru who unlocked Eastern spirituality for the materialist West. Although I chose the title deliberately, I wanted to query this view rather than reinforce it. I too want to talk about Vivekananda's relationship to Hinduism, nationalism, anti-colonialism, and karma yoga, the usual things, but depart from the constraining vision of him as a Hindu revivalist. Instead, I want to combine the Indian Vivekananda with the global guru that Westerners, and many Indians as well, came to venerate as the epitome of Indian spirituality, tolerance, and universalism. What's important to me is that there is only one man, a figure endlessly responding to circumstance and milieu and reacting on the hoof to different audiences. This is not some philosopher or theologian in an ivory tower. He's moving, he's traveling, he's trying to connect. I will not be talking about Vivekananda and his important to present-day India. Instead, I hope to bring to life the late 19th century world that he inhabited. It's hard now to recapture, to imagine the currents of fantasy globalism when Boston ladies in their drawing rooms read Max Muller's Sacred Books of the East, and educated Calcuttans read the American transcendentalist Ralph Waldo Emerson, something, by the way, that Vivekananda had read, and eminent scientists all over the world took spiritualism seriously. Science, religion, and the occult swirled in eddies that flowed into one another, and the conversations they provoked were all the more interesting and sometimes trenchant because of surging anti-colonialism. Above all, Vivekananda and his audiences everywhere envisage India through the Orientalist distinction between Eastern spirituality and Western materialism, the latter on extravagant display at America's Columbia Exposition. And there it is, a hodgepodge of neoclassical, monumental, canals, Venice, the only country that was non-Western in the center of the island was the Japanese Houdin. Such views meant that Vivekananda had to fight against stereotypes and prejudices, but these very oppositions permitted his entry into American and British circles as he deployed them to insist on India's unique importance for global culture. I want to show the paradox of how he asserted the value of different universalisms to those promulgated in the West, and to suggest that they were almost as various as the diversity that he treasured as central to India. The paradox remains that he had to often insert himself into the straitjacket of Orientalism. He did not come up with a seamless philosophy or system, far from it. Instead, he challenged Western hegemony and attempted to make people, both in India and the West, think outside the box. In the 1890s, he articulated a powerful critique of the claims of Christianity to be the sole religion of redemption, and did so before a Christian audience, while also rejecting atheist claims that science would replace spirituality. Let's take his famous appearance at the World Parliament of Religion in Chicago in 1893. He takes the podium and in every way rejects the stereotypes of both Indians and Westerners by not looking like anybody they have ever seen. The scarlet tunic and orange turban meant he resembled neither the wandering sadhu of Orientalist imaginings, nor the Western Christian minister in somber black with white collar. Rather than being grateful for being allowed to speak at all, he addressed his audience as sisters and brothers, not as masters. He does not see Jesus as the only path to salvation, although he readily accepts Christ as an avatar. He proclaims instead, We believe not only in universal toleration, but we accept all religions to be true. Words, bearing, and character all rejected what he regarded as Western fanaticism and the hegemony it claimed. Strangely, Vivekananda's remarks were greeted with wild applause. Why? That was the main question of the book. Somehow, he tapped into a vein of self-criticism, doubt, and vulnerability within his Western hearers. Witnesses remembered the thrill they experienced when he said that it was, quote, a sin to call you sinners, and then went on to attack Christian notions of original sin and hellfire. His words fell on fertile soil as he spoke to Americans' growing rejection of a punitive God and reconsidered their childhood relationship to the Bible as literal truth. Vivekananda's words, however, did not shift the views of Orthodox Christians. For them, Indians were heathens who worshipped idols, and he reacted badly when more than once women asked if Indian mothers threw their babies to crocodiles. If they were not heathens, then Indians were metaphysicians, taken up with a nihilistic transcendental search. More than once, Vivekananda was described as Jesuitical, a term that referred to the intellectual counter-Reformation priests of Europe to suggest a deceptive, if not brilliant, sophistry. Even the famous American philosopher and psychologist, William James, whom I'll speak about more, said that Hinduism was ultimately nothing more than what he called a sumptuosity of security. Vivekananda, who had engaged with James, resisted this cliché about characterless Indians incapable of dealing with real-world problems. Such remarks perhaps explains why he insisted on practical Vedanta. At worst, Westerners wanted a yogi who could perform magical tricks, not dissimilar to the Indian snake charmers of American vaudeville theaters. It makes it easier to understand why, in Raja Yoga, the first manual of yoga to be published in India, he concentrated on mental states rather than on, quote, getting occult powers. He deployed his knowledge provocatively by arguing against the separation between religion and science. This important and novel contribution not only rejected Christian exclusivism, but also the universalist claims of European rationalism and the Enlightenment. He welcomed scientific discoveries, especially evolution, about which he wrote quite extensively, thermodynamics, and germ theory, but believed they would confirm ancient Indian spiritual and cosmological truths and become, in the end, handmaidens to Vedanta. It seems to me, he said, that the conclusions of modern science are the very conclusions that Vedanta reached ages ago. But in modern science, they are written in the language of matter. He asserted that processes of creation and destruction outlined in evolution were already present in the laws of karma. As you know, Darwin had argued that in any given population, those slightly better adapted to an environment would succeed more in reproducing. Vivekananda accepted evolution, but not this idea of natural selection, especially for the higher reaches of human thought and morality. He was in good company. Even the co-discoverer of evolutionary theory, Alfred Russel Wallace, maintained that natural selection did not operate in such areas. I think it's important to realize that Vivekananda is following these debates and is engaged with them at the highest level. In rejecting what became social Darwinism, Vivekananda also rejected colonialism and realized that Western science could be used to beat Indians for failing to measure up to European standards in the same way that Christianity was deployed. He wrote that the survival of the fittest had, quote, furnished every oppressor with an argument to calm the qualms of conscience. He knew very well that these were exactly the arguments that were made by imperialists all over the world. Instead, he turned to Patanjali, who had explained that the quote, true secret of evolution is the manifestation of perfection, which is already in every being. Such statements appealed to his Western followers, who warmed to the idea of the essential self, or the authentic self, as being in tune with their own transcendental ideas. In London, he once said that if a man quotes a Moses or a Buddha or a Christ, he is laughed at, but let him give the name of Huxley or a Darwin, and it is swallowed without salt. With rare insight, he saw that scientific debate could be as full of metaphor, bias, and unacknowledged prejudice as controversies in religion. And I think these remarks especially were very brave and showed his ability to engage in intellectual debates that were deemed beyond Indians. Science for him was a vital part of the synthesis he created, but it was not an end in itself. He furthered this belief when he pressed Sister Nivedita to work with J.C. Bose to create what they called Vedantic science. And if you're interested in that, I have quite a bit on it in the book. Above all, however, he dwelled on experience. This was the buzzword of the moment, the notion that served as a bridge between him and his Western audience. They had rejected both conventional Christianity and the rationalist certainties of positivism in favor of what they called the new sciences of mind, emerging in especially psychology and anthropology. And they turned to Vivekananda for insights on perception, states of meditation, and what he deftly called superconsciousness. The people he dealt with were often alternative and avant-garde, and they listened when Vivekananda argued that modern science reinforced the ancient wisdom of India, and when he insisted that Indian spirituality promoted an experimental template for religious and spiritual universalism. Naturally, they saw his ideas through their own spiritual lens. Here we see Vivekananda at Greenacre, Maine, where they studied new ideas and practices and where he studied them. I don't know how many of you have seen this photograph, but it's one of my favorites. As usual, he's unmissable. He's wearing his turban, but here he's unmissable because he's with people who are so unlike him. This is a group of highly educated New England Yankees. While there, he saw about theosophy, which he had criticized but knew about, and he was intrigued by Christian Science, the idea that humanity's suffering was nothing more than waking dream shadows, a description strikingly like the Maya of Vedanta. Now we see what the vision of Christian Science. There's the founder of Christian Science. Her name is Mary Baker Eddy. This is one of the greatest religious revolutions in America at the end of the 19th century. And she claimed that the idea of egos in different bodies was just an illusion, and that people could, like Jesus exiting the tomb, be resurrected. Christian scientists, even today, refuse medical help. And you see in the background a woman praying. Vivekananda didn't like this. He thought there was interference, but he knew that his greatest audience in America were often Christian scientists. All his major female collaborators had started as Christian scientists or had gone to Christian Science before they came to him. He listened to spiritualist lectures, learned their views on comparative religion, and watched them perform healings. On the whole, he wasn't very impressed, and he found them spiritually dry, which is a wonderful word, and physically brittle, though he admired their virtue. The physical brittleness is interesting. He talked about the women who didn't even give up their corsets when they went sea bathing. And for this reason, he proceeded to give lessons in yoga under the so-called Swami's pine, where he hoped to bring both spiritual insight and physical flexibility. I think from the very beginning, it's important to understand that when he looked at the people he was working with, he was interested in embodiment as much as the highest flights of Hindu thought. Experience was so important to Vivekananda and his audiences, both abroad and in India, because it shifted attention away from textual study and intellect to the more personal and immediate connections to the divine. It was central to the semi-literate Ramakrishna, who had prioritized his mystical experience over sacred texts, and in the way William James emphasized it in his groundbreaking Varieties of Religious Experience, published in 1902, the year Vivekananda died, in which Vivekananda is cited several times. It has become one of the classic texts of mystical psychology. By emphasizing experience, both sides underscored their inner worlds, subjective understandings, and embodied awareness. Their view of religious experience, however, was very different despite this common terrain. Vivekananda spoke of Advaita, of the paradox of self and non-self that had a long and venerated metaphysical pedigree in India, but which his audience had difficulty understanding. Nonetheless, in both the East and West, Vivekananda, as well as the Westerners with whom he sparred, be they Harvard professors or theosophists, argued that the subject was not a free will agent of the dualism of Descartes, but one that recognized that experience signified possibilities beyond the realm of objects and rational deduction. In my view, this intuition may explain why feminine experience was often central to apprehending what was deemed beyond the masculine domain of reason. William James, for example, had recourse to female mediums in his research. And here he is with someone who ultimately was considered one of the greatest frauds of the end of the 19th century, Eusapia Palladino, a famous Italian medium. But it was important also for Vivekananda, who acknowledged women's spiritual power. Now, his reliance on women demands a reassessment of many things, but in my view, especially what Western historians have called the feminization of religion in the 19th century. The term conjures up the armies of Christian female missionaries who worked at home in the colonies. Vivekananda inverted the normal alliances with Western women opposing Christian missionaries and even becoming anti-imperialists, while Indian female figures became the new saints of the movement. I will say more in a few minutes about Sharada Devi. Connections with women were crucial for the way Vivekananda internationalized his enterprise. To succeed, he needed to put the world of Western activists and alternative spirituality together with Hindu wifehood, motherhood, and female sainthood. These aims were often profoundly contradictory, and later he was troubled that he could not find reliable Western men to support his efforts. And if you want to know why, I can explain that perhaps in the Q&A. Nonetheless, these women were crucial to creating worldwide Vedanta and central to promoting a vision of India as the world's spiritual teacher, a notion which still has tremendous force today in India. The relationship of Vivekananda to this women's world was crucial to his changing view of Hinduism. The stories are legendary. Early on in India, he was reluctant to undertake new ventures without the support of Ramakrishna's widow, Sharada Devi, requiring her permission before leaving for America. He learned about American religion from women and was struck by their moral and intellectual independence, even if later he became more critical. He was welcomed into the unusual world of highly educated Yankee ladies, which included novelists, female lecturers and reformers, women with old Puritan pedigrees, often substantial wealth, and links to Harvard academics and New England theologians. And here we see Sarah Bull's calm mother, Sarah Bull, and without her, many of the buildings at Belor Mat would never have been constructed. Even though they had fantasies about the Orient, for most, Vivekananda was their first encounter with a real South Asian. They were astonished by his beauty, intelligence, and wit, and overwhelmed him with curiosity and hospitality. His celibacy enabled a rare social intimacy, which also paradoxically reinforced an image of manly restraint, so important to his self-vision as a renouncer. Although the sexual boundary was observed, at times distressing emotional entanglements resulted in hurt on both sides. And it's very interesting to see these letters, both from Vivekananda and from the women, in a world where there is no guru-disciple relationship yet, and where he's trying to build it. And they are both dealing with questions of how to create it in a different culture. Above all, and in deliberate contrast to Christian missionaries, he sought no converts. He created Vedanta societies for sure, but he also said famously that he only wanted to make a Methodist a better Methodist, the Presbyterian a better Presbyterian, the Unitarian a better Unitarian. And by doing so, he sought to exemplify the tolerance that for him was the essence of Hinduism, describing India's welcome of Jews after the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem and the embrace of fleeing Zoroastrians. This example of the Jews was particularly important to him because he was very aware of Western anti-Semitism. He therefore presented so-called spiritual India at the Parliament as the eternal refuge, a portrayal which set aside growing intercommunal rivalry between Hindus and Muslims, as well as the whole question of untouchability. He sidestepped Pandita Ramabai's concern for the unhappy state of Hindu women, afraid that her critiques would diminish Indians. Because of British power, he remained always on the defensive. His discourse on tolerance, a word he really did not like, revealed another dimension of an essentialized Hinduism that was internationalized, but also vital to his national vision. This, I suggest, is the profound paradox of claiming to be the guru to the world, which is why I titled the book in this way. Above all, contrary to the man-making stereotype in India, in America, he said, quote, "I am a woman amongst women." And he and the women he associated with experimented with these new relationships in ways that were both life-enhancing and disruptive. He remarked in 1897 when he returned to India, "If I have to come back again as a woman, I must and will come back as an American woman." He compared which is not what we would expect from Vivekananda. He compared their freedoms to the constraints that ruled Indian women, whose condition had been at the center of both reformist and orthodox debate over westernization for decades. But it was still very difficult for him. He acknowledged American women's moral force, despite his ambivalence over their philanthropy and activism, which he continued to fear might be directed at his fellow Indians in a way that would cause dependence. He remained wary of coercive Western emancipation, especially for Indian women. Although violently opposed to child marriage, he was cautious on the subject of widow remarriage, which he regarded as a spiritual death. I truly believe that Vivekananda could not envisage his mother, who was a widow, remarrying. Brides, he continued to believe, should be subordinate to the son's mother until they became mothers in turn, and he said so loudly during a lecture in no place other than California. He also had an exalted view of Sharada Devi, and she was key to how he envisaged the maternal in his theology, but she was, above all, a living spiritual guide. Now, the problem with Sharada Devi is we never have her words. We only have witnesses' accounts. But we know that she made a tremendous impression on people. When he returned to India for the first time in 1897, he washed himself in the Ganges before meeting her so as not to contaminate her with foreign corruption. Ordinarily, he derided such rituals as don't touchism. But with her, he readily cast aside his cloak of enlightenment in search for the proper purification. Sharada became paramount in his mission because, at least in his eyes, she seemed able to square the circle, to be the ideal Hindu woman while also resisting convention, first by continuing to wear her wedding bangles and red bordered sari as a widow, and later by sharing food with his foreign female devotees. And there she is with Sharada Devi, and there's a long discussion about her willingness to come and welcome them. Despite the many constraints placed on Brahmin widows, she was everywhere. She apparently attacked a mischievous disciple who by slapping him and holding his tongue. No, it's the opposite. When she was attacked by a mischievous disciple, she apparently slapped him and held his tongue to make him stop. She continued to help sex workers against Ramakrishna's advice and believed she honored him by using her own judgment. Indeed, time and again, she told the Western women that that's what surrender to the Guru meant. Vivekananda never used those words. And her husband died, and after her husband died, she traveled far and wide, counseled the poor and mighty, and cooked endlessly for each disciple, tailoring each dish to the monk's physiological makeup and preference. Of course, the last service was also a metaphor for spiritual progress. Each person needed to find a religious path suitable to his or her spiritual constitution. These stories were told again and again in the hagiographies to show how Sharada Devi was esteemed for her practical application of this understanding. He was devoted to her and regarded her as a saint that he would never become. But there is no doubt that he was caught out by the very idealizations that he created, because he required many different kinds of workers. And he found another ideal and created another ideal with Margaret Noble, the Scotch-Irish woman he called his Celtic lioness, who met him in London and followed him back to Calcutta. There she Hinduized herself and connected with other global intellectuals. While he and Tagore never met, she did associate with Tagore, the Japanese art historian and Pan-Asianist Okakura Kakutsu, and of course, J.C. Bose. Vivekananda christened her the dedicated one, and she undertook the task both of articulating his world significance and embedding aspects of his theology into a nascent Indian nationalism. Perhaps more than Vivekananda, she pushed for the Indian national idea. Often, especially while in the West, he argued against nationalism, against the survival of the fittest, as I've explained. And when she first came to India, Nivedita suggested that she was, quote, the most loyal English woman that ever breathed. After she said that, he railed at her and called such attachment a sin. In fact, he made her cry often when she expressed herself in this, what he thought, imperialist way. Other times, however, his talk of the sacred motherland suggested that he shared this dangerous love of country. She believed that he exemplified the national idea, but was not its spokesman or theoretician, a role that she sought for herself. It is true that, although he spoke often of man-making and the Kshatriya force, she, not he, developed these ideas after his death in a 1905 pamphlet called Aggressive Hinduism, published during Swadeshi. For Vivekananda, she was his Besant in the making, and she reshaped his message when he re-embraced Kali worship in 1898 on a pilgrimage to Kir Bhawani in the Himalayas. He famously wrote a poem about the goddess and discussed Kali's infinite darkness, power for destruction, and love of madness. When he returned, he withdrew and was no longer interested in, quote, doing good. He even told Nivedita that patriotism was a mistake. I have more to say about Nivedita's fear of this non-self that Vivekananda embraced at this crucial moment of his life. For now, I'll suggest that her incomprehension was later transformed into a deep appreciation of Kali's power. And again, if you want to discuss it in the Q&A, it's hard for perhaps Indians to understand what it was like for Christians used to a patriarchal God who did not worship the Virgin because they were Protestants to encounter Kali. She became the goddess's foremost Western advocate, And later, the books and lectures, it seems, were done in collaboration with Vivekananda. But later, there were suggestions that she rewrite some of it, and she refused unless Vivekananda personally ordered her to do so. He never did. Vivekananda was savvy in finding a forward-looking British woman of education to present Kali's case. Kali worship horrified the Brahmos and Westerners equally, with such devotion seen as revealing the perceived lower levels of Hindu worship. She confronted this head-on. She even went to Kalighat, where goats are sacrificed, and where she stated that, quote, "The great glory of this mother worship lies in its bestowal of manhood." For men like Aurobindo and Bipin Chandra Pal, her book recast Kali from being a symbol of national degeneration into an icon of national dynamism. They thought it her greatest contribution. And now I'd like to come to the last part of my lecture and to revert to the question of the two Vivekanandas. At first glance, it does seem that his message altered according to his audience. In the West, he emphasized universality, insisting that Christians recognize the world's diversities. In India, he was apparently concerned with the Gita and the biceps, a statement that in fact he made only once, even though it became the rubric by which he is almost inevitably condemned or applauded today. Even if we set aside such stereotypes, he did repeat the man-making message to his monks and in many other Indian settings. Was he then, in the end, like the Buddha, who used skillful speech to speak differently to different publics? Ordinarily, when people talk about the Buddha and Vivekananda, they trace metaphysical and spiritual connections. But in a conversation with the novelist Kirthik Sasidaran, I began to think about the Buddha's impact in a different way. Vivekananda seemed to employ the Buddha's method of skillful speech to draw people away from extremes. Certainly, in the West, he preached against materialism, violence, and fanaticism, his national pride focusing on Indian tolerance and inclusion. He sought to introduce yoga to draw Westerners away from muscular Christianity, from what he perceived as the hardness of their minds and bodies. Against Western brutality, he hoped to teach mildness. Against the busyness of Western commercialism and punctuality, he asserted the primacy of meditation and explained that processes of concentration were not ends but means. Unlike Christian scientists, he did not seek miraculous cure, but advised, it said, instead, perseverance and endurance in the search for transcendence. And to achieve his ends, he scolded, a habit which the Western women found hard to bear. He was not sensitive to the gender dynamics of their interaction. But he also criticized what he saw as Western chivalry, as a form of sex that hampered women's strength. As much as amongst Indian men, he sought to promote robustness among his female acolytes, though he did not call it man-making. Indeed, the inability to find other words shows the stereotype's deep-rootedness. But besides the scolding, he also encouraged and, above all, listened. Despite his socially conservative view of women, he surprised them by his attentiveness. They were stunned that he actually ground spices and made curries for them. They had never had a man cook for them. His often traditional statements about women did not preclude a vision of their spiritual importance or their genuine interest in their religious and effective lives. So if this was his technique in the West, in India he preached otherwise. His nationalism expressed differently. He wanted to end what he saw as Indian timidity, to shift attitudes of subservience and fear, and above all, to resist imitation. When young and traveling across the breadth and length of India, he took two books, the Gita, of course, and The Imitation of Christ by Thomas à Kempis, a 15th century text that urged Christians to withdraw for the world in search of spiritual growth. He loved this book and taught it to everyone he could. But he also loved it because it indicted the arrogance of British missionaries in his own time. But later he became more ambivalent about imitation and its suggestion of colonial inferiority, the desire to imitate those who were the conquerors. When, for example, he came to the World Parliament, he advocated universalism, but also self-respecting differentiation. He said, "The Christian is not to become a Hindu or a Buddhist, nor a Hindu or a Buddhist to become a Christian, but each must assimilate the spirit of the others and yet preserve his individuality." In my view, he was laboring to understand how one changed while remaining oneself, an existential concern that he returned to throughout his life. Such issues, of course, were profoundly personal, but also cultural and political. How did a people or a nation alter itself or find new sources of strength without surrendering its values and identity? He wondered as early as 1894 if Indians could become Occidental in energy activism and equality while remaining Hindu in religion. But by religion, he meant not just spiritual concerns, but also cultural values. How could India remain open to the world without losing itself in harmful Western ideas? How were Indians, both as individuals and as a nation, to realize themselves? He proclaimed in California in 1900, "Religion is not an imitation of Jesus or Muhammad. Imitation is never genuine. Be not an imitation of Jesus, but be Jesus. You are quite as great as Jesus, Buddha, or anybody else." And such skillful speech was part of the pulling and prodding his audiences to the middle, away from the extremes that hampered them. I have suggested that he taught meditation to urge Westerners away from busyness, distraction, and hardness. However, when he returned to India, he constrained the spontaneity of his guru brothers and with new routines and regulations. In Beler Mat, he introduced the Delsart method, a system of breath control and expression exercise pioneered by French singing and acting coach François Delsart. I think this is remarkable because he had mocked this method while in the West, advocating instead a control of the pranayama and criticizing the divas. Vivekananda was a famous singer, and he knew a lot of actresses and singers in the West, including Sarah Bernhardt. In addition to the Delsart, they had to start training with dumbbells to deepen the physical endurance that was necessary for practical Vedanta. So he turned this all around and brought the West back to Beler Mat. This takes us to what in India is regarded as the core of his teaching, practical Vedanta and Karma Yoga. He deployed them in a way that fought against the Western stereotypes of Indians as natural metaphysicians, an argument that the British made to deprive Indians especially of higher education and science. Practical Vedanta, in my view, emerged hand in hand with his hatred of what he called don't-touchism. Speaking of the endless ceremonials, food prohibitions, and bans against caste intermarriage and dining, he concluded, "Those whose heads have a tendency to be troubled day and night over such questions simply deserve the name of wretches." He argued against, quote, "the fictitious differentiation between religion and the life of the world," and in the process reshaped Advaita Vedanta. For Vivekananda, Advaita proposed unity and solidarity among all human beings, a worship of the divine within, a vision of universality and connection that had so seduced his Western hearers. Even today, his vision of Advaita Vedanta may offend the orthodox. While some might perceive his practical Vedanta as a betrayal of Ramakrishna, who had warned against philanthropists' worldly desire for so-called name and fame, he even had to shift the attitudes of his beloved brother disciples, who remained distressed at handling money and writing official reports for publication of their efforts to feed the famine-stricken. But he persisted and their dedication became a model for this new kind of service. Remember, he gave his famous London lectures on practical Vedanta before his return to India in 1897, in the midst of the horrible hunger that killed 12 million Indians. The famine shook him to the core. His view of Advaita Vedanta also helped him envisage the nation. During his return tour in 1897, he spoke about Indian diversity and how unity could only be achieved by celebrating the mosaic of cultures and religions that comprised India. He never worried about so-called racial mixing, nor did he ever suggest segregation. He prioritized Advaita for metaphysical reasons, but also because he disliked sectarianism. He proclaimed, one sect has one particular form of ritual and thinks that it's holy, while rituals of another are simply arrant superstition. Advaita, by emphasizing formlessness, asserted that unity existed above particularity. This was vital to India precisely because of its diversity. He said, here have been the Aryan, the Dravidian, the Tartar, the Turk, the Mughal, the European, all the nations of the world pouring their blood into this land. He recognized that language, race, or ethnicity could not bring Indians together. Instead, he emphasized, admittedly, a Hindu vision of Advaitic unity that encouraged all spiritual inclinations to find shelter under its capacious umbrella. This is what I think he meant when he extolled, quote, our sacred religion, our religion as the one common ground. He openly acknowledged enmity between Hindu and Muslim brothers, but also believed that fraternity would and should outweigh rivalry and antipathy. Of course, this vision of Advaita prioritized a Hindu idea, a notion of embrace and connection that non-Hindus might resist. His Karma Yoga was an explicit program of national rejuvenation that steered between reformist meliorism and reactionary revivalism. He also focused on compassionate and disinterested activism. He wanted the renouncer to retain the otherworldly subjectivity of yore, but now to tackle India's contemporary problems. The sannyasin, he maintained, was ideally suited to join in life's endless flux while retaining inner stillness. However, the transcendent and the mundane were no longer meant to oppose one another. He also encouraged these ideals amongst householders, but I will end by exploring the suggestion of militancy in his thought. When, after his pilgrimage in Kirbawani, he wanted nothing more than to sit in the lap of Kali, Nivedita was appalled and even called the doctor. He wanted to experience the non-self by becoming one with the mother. But she did not understand that it allowed him to shed the hyperactivity that had distinguished him as America's cyclonic monk. This momentary relinquishing of plans and power enabled him to find the detachment he needed to re-enter the fray. By returning to babyhood, by going into the lap of Kali, he reclaimed unworldliness before re-engaging. And I will end by saying he showed his radical edge to his Western acolytes, who didn't always understand. When visiting the dungeon cages of Mont Saint-Michel in Normandy, and I don't know if any of you have ever been there, but you can see it's an island where the tide comes in and goes out. And it's a place where you really are imprisoned. And when he saw it, he muttered under his breath, "What a wonderful place to meditate." These prison cells had contained the political prisoners under the Bourbon absolutism and continued to function until the 1860s. He advocated the marshaling of vital energy against tyranny and revealed how the deepest renunciation could also encompass the highest activism. When Aurobindo awaited trial in 1908 in prison, he saw Vivekananda in a vision and urged his comrades to follow a yogic form of revolutionary asceticism, a new kind of lila, or divine play, that entailed self-control, moral strength, and physical endurance. They became Krishna in the prison house. What is so interesting is that he used the middle way to urge his hearers away from extremes, but at certain moments, the militant edge remained. This explains why, over a generation ago, people, especially in Bengal, came to Vivekananda as socialists on the left. And today, he also inspires the more radical on the right. For all these reasons, Vivekananda is truly a movable feast, provocative, undoubtedly significant, but infinitely faceted. Because he died at 39, we can never truly know what his future course might have been. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ruth. Just like your vivid book, the lecture was brimming with insights. Thank you so much. For this evening's conversation, we are delighted to have Supriya Nair in our midst. She is a journalist and editor from Bombay. She is a co-founder of the media company All Things Small, and editor of the publication 52. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, Foreign Policy, and Vogue. She was books columnist for the Mumbai Mirror from 2018 to 20. Over to you, Supriya. Thank you.
Thanks, Ruben. Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. Well, here we are with our sisters and brothers of the Habitat Center. That phrase is so iconic, Vivekananda's, and it amazed me that you were able to resist opening your lecture with that. But maybe that would have been a little too cheeky.
It's definitely too cheeky and a little bit too cliched.
Too cheeky for an academic, but never for a journalist who, we're not known for resisting cliches. I came to Ruth's book as something of a blank slate. Vivekananda has, for me, like for many of you over here, been a part of everyday life. I came from a home where, there was his picture next to that of the atheist communist Bhagat Singh. In Bombay, I live walking distance from a place that is officially known as Chicago Square. It's just sort of a completely normal, there's like a police station there. It's not a special or a sacred place. The first library I went to was named after him. So I practically learned to read like at the Ramakrishna Mission near my house. And yet, if you'd asked me to describe what his effect on on the inner lives of Indians was, I wouldn't have been able to tell you. And I'm a little nervous about being in conversation with Ruth because her book manages to unite so many different strands of what was special and contradictory and stubborn and difficult about him and his thinking that I'm not sure where to begin to untangle these things. So let me ask about you and your process instead, to start with. Your previous work was not about India. You're a historian of France. How did you come to, and I know he visited Paris, I learned this from your book, but I'm guessing that is not how you came to him. How did this happen?
I was reading about a French pacifist and intellectual named Romain Rolland, and he had this fantasy that he was going to get Gandhi to Europe and that Gandhi would revitalize Europe, bring Eastern spirituality to the West, and end the rise of fascism. And this was a fancy that was very odd, and I couldn't understand why. And as time went on, he did indeed have Gandhi to stay. They did indeed talk. But then I discovered that he also had written a book about Ramakrishna and Vivekananda. And in this book on Vivekananda, I saw that there was this arrogant French intellectual who was talking about India, Ramakrishna, Vivekananda, and William James, who was the great American psychologist. And Roland was astonished. Here was a global American intellectual, the first he had encountered. And of course, as you can tell by my accent, I'm American, even though I'm at Oxford. And at that moment, all my worlds came together. One of the things about Oxford is we have an army of South Asians. And I was beginning to go to these seminars because of the interest in the work of Roland and Gandhi. And that's where I came to it. And it was so hard because people, academics or specialists, they did not like it that I was leaving my terrain. People thought that I was acting strangely. And I discovered a whole new world in writing this book.
And that through Roland, you chose not Gandhi, but Vivekananda.
Because of the letters, I started to read the letters. And unlike you, I did not know about Vivekananda's contemporary resonance. So like you, I came to it almost as a tabula rasa. And so my view was different. It's only later that I understood that every Indian, most Indians, have something of Vivekananda within them or within their familial history. That took a long time for me to realize I was that naive.
I don't think that's naivete, but I think, truly our inner lives are concealed from one another in ways that we don't immediately recognize, especially because, this is so easy, right? I would like to take the audience back to the 1890s, which you dwelt on at some length in your lecture. But just for a sense of this moment of encounter that makes Vivekananda's extraordinary journey in the West possible, what else is going on in that moment?
It's a really good question. One of the things I feel I must do as an historian is recreate worlds that people just can no longer imagine. We have to acknowledge that we can never separate ourselves from the past, but at the same time, it's a fallacy to read history backwards and to view what's inserted into our contemporary world through what happened in the 1890s. I mean, Vivekananda didn't even live through Swadeshi, let alone the freedom struggle. So he had no idea what was to come. So what is this world? It's a world of imperialism, but it's also a world where many Westerners are beginning to rethink their relationship both to their own religion and to science. They're beginning to look for alternative spiritual solutions. They have come out of a grievous mourning period after the Civil War. And they are trying to connect with their lost sons. And at the same time, they are looking for new approaches. And because of that, they're reading Max Muller's Sacred Books of the East. They're reading the Dhammapada by the Buddha. And in fact, I would suggest that this was much more popular reading in the 1890s than it is today. Right. And that's hard to envisage, I think.
And this is quite this is quite different from, the American provincialism that I think a lot of Europeans were talking about even then, right? Like Henry James, William James's brother, who is not European, but kind of implants in us that, everyone's just kind of huddled up in their like little Calvinist bubbles.
That's another thing. I mean, on one level, it isn't true, but on another level, it is truly true. Which is, what's interesting is between the two James brothers, they collaborate on psychology, one in the novel and one in, quote, science.
That's right.
So it's very interesting. And yes, the Calvinism of their childhoods no longer seems fit for purpose. They're told that they have to be members of the elect to be redeemed, and that anxiety that they will not be redeemed no longer seems so harsh. And it's with that you have to understand when Vivekananda says to them, you are not sinners. And when he makes statements about the horrors of original sin, Apparently in Chicago, there was like a tremor that went through the hall. I mean, this was not something that people openly said.
Yeah. You know, when people like me who are undergraduates in English classes are taught about the Victorian world, we're taught about Darwin and suddenly, faith in God dropping away. And I think one of the things that Ruth's book brought home to me was just how faith in God could be reshaped and transformed. And it wasn't just replaced entirely by a void. If you haven't read the book, some of you may have, you probably heard and understood through the lecture just how extraordinary Vivekananda's relationships with women were. Ruth will tell us more about that, but Ruth, that kind of symptomatically says something about the men he encountered, right? And the fact that they didn't become part of the circle. What was going on over there?
It's really interesting and very important. I think you would find that he does, at the beginning, engage with a lot of men, but as more women flock around him, there is this growing fear, which is still part of the fear of Hindu gurus, that he is somehow seducing them, but not, in his case, sexually, but mentally. That there's almost a hysteria amongst the women. And there are things to bind them together, which is that Vivekananda is an outsider, and the women also have resentments. They're highly educated. They're in these American colleges. The man who runs the World Parliament of Religions is also the man who becomes the first president of Oberlin, which is a co-educational institution.
The first in the United States,
yes,
am I right? Yeah.
Yes.
I learned that from your book.
One of the things that I find so interesting about what's going on here is that they see him as an ally, and the men are more wary because he isn't like any other man they know. And because of his relationship to other Indian women at home, he sees them in terms of being mothers and sisters. And this relationship is, again, perceived as odd, I think, by the men, and discomforting. At the same time, it's not that he doesn't have any male followers, it's just that the women become much more activist and indeed much more radical. And that's what's so surprising.
Right. Some sense that maybe there's something at stake for them that the men aren't quite going after or are able to grasp at through Vivekananda.
I think it's also on the level of spirituality and personal connection that, the dour English descended Yankee clergyman just did not enable them to express all their worries. And I also think he listened. I mean, I think that this is the hardest thing to understand, because he also scolded. I mean, in India, he scolded the monks too, but they were used to it. Even Ramakrishna scolded him. Yeah. And in some way, you can tell me if I'm wrong, I think he brought the intimacy of Indian households and the guru-disciple relationship into the American context. And of course, they found it really upsetting. They felt he was attacking the ego. And the idea that they could be like attached to other egos and lose their individuality went very much against the American ethos. And yet it was that at the same time that was liberating. So it's again the paradox as much for them as it was for him.
This fluidity in gender relations and the guru-disciple relationship are really closely linked, right? Because that is what Vivekananda gets himself as someone who is part of an aspirational English-educated Bengali middle class when he encounters Ramakrishna and has this extraordinary kind of love story, right, that takes place between the two of them. Could you dwell a little bit about, on that, and also on just what it was like to try and bring that together for this book, because it is so extraordinarily complicated?
I think what I was trying to do is that most historians are intellectual historians, so they focus on ideas. Then there are those who are social historians. But I was trying to show that none of this would have occurred except for these emotional bonds and connections. And of course, that's seen as sort of sometimes, airy-fairy. But we all know that these interconnections, the people who spark our imaginations, and his connection with Ramakrishna was like that. I mean, he was a Brahmo. He, like many others in Calcutta, went to Dakshineshwar almost as a religious tourist to visit Ramakrishna because he had already become famous. And there he was. Ramakrishna loved him in a way that he constantly said was greater and more intense than anything his parents had ever loved him, and his parents loved him deeply. And it was there that he learned about the sexless Atman. And at the same time, we have to understand Vivekananda's ambition. Apparently, at the first meeting, he asked Ramakrishna, "Have you ever seen God?" And of course, what's so interesting for Vivekananda is that he wants to see God. He wants to encounter the divine. He's looking for darshan. And even though later he becomes what he calls a severe Advaitist, he constantly reiterates that with Ramakrishna had realized everything through an idol. He doesn't even use the word image, he uses the word idol.
Right.
And so he
Which has quite a resonance in the West, right? That means something bad.
Absolutely. And of course, remember that image worship is prescribed in Brahmoism. So this is a transformation and a spiritual reconciliation of the most extraordinary kind. And above all, because this charismatic Ramakrishnan guru, he inverts the normal relationship. Vivekananda says he is a brain-sick baby. And what Vivekananda is the mother and father. And why this image of the child, of Kali's child, is so important is that it's the child that is universal. It is before religion, custom, caste, learning, education. And Vivekananda learns a very important lesson there, that only he thinks a religious genius like Ramakrishna can teach, that it is those who know nothing who can know everything.
Right. Just one of the paradoxes, I guess, that you have to come to terms with in his life and his work and his message. This tussle, with caste and religion and things that many Indians are going through at that time when they're trying to figure out how to think about these things and how to live in a world where the old strictures are not quite going to serve them, but that are hard to give up. He's very much in the middle of that fight, right? And that's one of the reasons why, looking back now, which I think is very tempting for a lot of people to do, and say, oh, but Vivekananda said X about Islam, or he said Y about untouchability, isn't really all that useful, right?
Well, it's very difficult for me because we have the collected works, but we don't even know if there are other things there,
Oh, so there might be like things missing in the archive.
Maybe, well, in the collected works. And I asked. On the other hand, I do think it is very important to go beyond catching people out,
Right.
To understand their oeuvre on the whole, which is why I've talked about the single Vivekananda, about unifying these two worlds and trying to think along with him. The other thing about, Muslims is he did criticize Muslims, but by the standard of his day, amongst many Hindus, he criticized them much less.
You're right.
So it's not to excuse him, but to recognize that we have different standards than those of his day. And he was also an idealist, so he thought of the Hindu idea, the Islamic religion. He both essentialized them and aggrandized them. So it was often difficult for him to look at nuance, because he was, again, preaching to audiences, especially in America, who knew very little about what he was describing.
Right. You really do give us a sense of just how difficult that was. One of the things you don't do because you are a gifted historian is to speculate on his inner life as he's trying to resolve all of these paradoxes. But I have to ask you, you know, as someone who has lived with him now for many years, as you were writing about this, how hard is that on him? Like, what do you think is happening within him?
Well, I think that what is clear is that he's terribly ill.
Right. It takes a real toll on him.
This whole business of having to appear as the cyclonic monk, there are terrible moments when he speaks about for him, the horrors of punctuality, you know?
Yeah.
The horrors of being on time. He scolds his acolytes for not living and experiencing the moment or seeing the spiritual possibilities around them. When he returns to India, he is bruised by having to have his head shaved again and wearing a cowpin, which he doesn't want to wear, because he feels he's being pushed back into a role that will satisfy the Orthodox, but not satisfy him. These are all aspects of the exhaustion. He was terribly depleted. And he talks often when he was, for example, doing Bellarmine, setting up the Bellarmine rules. He said, I'm organizing, he wrote to Josephine MacLeod, I'm organizing, I'm running, I'm doing, I'm trying. But he said, my heart is back in Dakshineshwar, sitting under the tree with Ramakrishna. So there's that relationship of vulnerability to strength, assertiveness to wanting to hide away. There are moments when he says that he gets terribly ill after the return to India because there's just too many people, there's too much going on, there's too many accolades, and he has to go away for months to recover his health. These are just aspects of what it means to be a global citizen. It's highly problematic.
Yeah.
And can be torturous, and hence why, and tortured, and hence why he develops these views on imitation, that you mustn't imitate, you must be more. But the question of what isn't imitation any longer remains, because the world is changing. Hence, the constant relationship and wrestling with concepts like Advaita and Karma Yoga, and feeling all the time and wondering if he's doing right. He writes about his doubts quite a lot. The person who writes even more about her doubts is Nivedita. For her, it's just, she's never sure that he would approve, and at the same time, she too very much wants to assert herself.
I want to ask you more about Nivedita, but we've gotten a sign that it's perhaps starting to get away from us. So I'd like to bring the audience in here at this point, and then I will cannibalize your time, ladies and gentlemen. Ma'am, in the front row, and if we could have, some better lighting, just so that Ruth can see who she's speaking with, that would be great.
Yeah, I'd love to see your face.
Hi, thank you for a very stimulating conversation. I'm like you, grew up under the shadow of, a saint Vivekananda, and I've returned after 35 years of living abroad to re-examine Vivekananda and all the contradictions that have surfaced. I haven't read your book, but I just want to focus on one thing, which is your term, the feminization of religion. Mm-hmm. Vivekananda's relationship with Ramakrishna and Sharda Devi. There has been so much said about, besides the Kali's child, about Ramakrishna's sexuality himself, and Vivekananda's attempt to find the homosocial, which gets misunderstood as the homoerotic, mm-hmm. And then his, wanting to be a woman among women, et cetera, et cetera. But he's also working under this very rigid and very scurrilous characterization of the Bengali Babu by the British, of being effete, impotent, effeminate, and incapable of self-rule, which is my addition. He's wanting to be a woman with all of the characteristics of a demonic but very powerful Kali, but he's also having to distance himself from what the British characterize as the Bengali Babu, and I think that contradiction is now what I'm understanding is what killed him. Your comments.
I would agree, and you'll see I write very much about all this. Okay, I mean, he's responding to so many things. And what in some ways, I was trying to argue against the view that his internal feminine had been destroyed, or that he had surrendered it. And what was interesting is that it might have been, and I don't say this in the book, but it might have been that he was able to express it more readily in America than in India at this point because of what was going on. He had an enemy, which was muscular Christianity. And it's not surprising that Nivedita wrote about aggressive Hinduism. But he always made the distinction between strength and force. He wanted strength, but he didn't want force. And he wanted assertion, but he didn't want coercion. You see? And I think those are the distinctions that have been lost in this argument. In the speech where he talks about the Gita and the biceps, in the speech before, he talks about a small sadhu confronting Alexander the Great and besting Alexander the Great. So it's both sides, and these warring sides, I think, are part of his psyche, but I also think they're part of the political and cultural debate that is overwhelming them, but also particular to Bengal. And it's that Bengali self, the cooking, singing, music playing. He doesn't sing in America, he chants, but he doesn't sing. Because I think you asked me what I think he's afraid of being feminized in America. Yeah. Right. And part of the bridge of connection to Ramakrishna was through the singing. But he does connect with all of these divas, Emma Thursby, and many other opera singers. And that's why he brings Delsart back to the monastery. You see what I'm saying? So he is inventive, he's creative, he's constantly pedagogical, he's trying to teach, and yet at the same time, I said he's trying to pull and prod his audiences towards the middle. That's also his issue. And yet, he also knows there are times when you can't go to the middle, which is why he invokes the radicalism of the sannyasin's disinterestedness as a model for his monks, but also for householders.
Right. And he's trying to pull America away from muscular Christianity. But you never come to the conclusion in the book that he's pulling them towards like a muscular Hinduism instead. There's something more complicated.
No way.
Yeah, there's something more complicated going on.
Yeah.
There's a gentleman at the back in a gray jacket. Thank you.
Would you mind?
Yes, we can see your hands, even though it's difficult, and we'll come to you.
Do you mind if I get up and just walk around a bit? It makes me more comfortable, and I'll get out of the spotlight.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Thank you for giving a very sensitive exposition and showing how Vivekananda stopped short of syncretism, although he encouraged communication. But what I wanted to draw your attention to is the present age. Do you see, like I do, that there is now a sort of a reversal to the time when Vivekananda was alive, which means tremendous rising suspicion in the West towards the very concept of guru. In France, you are a French scholar, guru has become a really dirty word. I mean, it's associated with every kind of fraud and exploitation. And interestingly, Buddhism has made deep inroads in the West, but Hinduism still meets with that deep monotheistic prejudice. And interestingly, Swami Vivekananda doesn't seem to have, somehow, you said he was practically forgotten. And that may be a reason why Hinduism somehow hasn't become understood as much as Buddhism might be, at least in some circles in the West. Thank you.
Or believed to be understood.
Right.
Yeah. I think what you're saying about the guru is spot on. I think the guru is associated with business often, and fraud, and some kind of often New Age nonsense. So it's all of those things. I think it's also associated with some kind of exploitation, at worst, sexual exploitation. I would agree with what you said about monotheism and the fact that Buddhism, in contrast in the West, is seen as something that is atheists and can embrace because of its ethical principles. But there's also a 19th century background, which is that Buddhism was seen as the second religion at the Parliament because it was the Sermon on the Mount and the ethics of compassion were seen as joined together. In fact, there were those who even wanted constantly to say that the Buddha had come first and the Christians, which is why we have these fantasies of what Jesus did while he was in India during his adolescence, and when he returned to the West, he could not have learned what he learned without Hindus and Buddhists. I think there are other reasons why Hinduism is not accepted in the same way, and that's because of the vast Hindu diaspora who are associated with other movements that are seen as either Hindu nationalist or Hare Krishna movements. And that is seen as somehow on the fringe. But for many Indians abroad, those are the movements that they embrace. So it's not necessarily ones that Westerners will embrace. It's amazing how many Jews in America, and they're called Jubus, have embraced Buddhism because it is seen as a profoundly ethical culture, but without the monotheism.
There's a gentleman in the front row, if we can pass the mic to him. In the front row, Vandana. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm heartiest congratulations for such a scholarly contribution.
I can't hear. Can you pull it away just a little bit? The microphone. That's it.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Better.
Heartiest congratulations for such a scholarly contribution. Okay, really wonderful. I just want to say something. If we change, I may be wrong. That is the title of the book. Okay. If I say, since you've covered so many things. Okay. If I say Guru of the world.
Yeah, of the world.
Guru of the world, because he clearly mentioned that I have a message to the West, and the Buddha have a message to the East.
Yeah.
And several places he left so much influence on, especially American, Britishers, Swiss people, Austrian, everywhere. So I think it is just my suggestion, because he said that, of course, I love my India, but for me, the entire world is my family. So it just came in my mind that because Guru to the world, Guru of the world.
It's really interesting what you're raising, because one of the Ramakrishnan monks was really angry at me for using this title, because he thought it did evoke the fakery, and business. But then there were many who also thought it was amazing that I used this title.
Right. Did you get some commentary on possibly like political valence to this?
No, not at all. They were very, very careful, but they were also what they were fearful of was that I would not write respectfully, and that was really what worried them. And they have been very welcoming to me and have asked me to speak at the Vedanta societies in America, which really surprised me, and have been, because The book is a humanizing portrait of Vivekananda. He is not a saint in my book, and I talk about how he did not want to be a saint. I mean, one of the things that I find so interesting about Vivekananda is how he put himself in a holy lineage. And it was Ramakrishna and Sharada, but he never saw himself as their equal. And that was, you know, in certain audiences, when we speak about the smoking and the eating of the meat, which really can upset some people, that's the side of Vivekananda as well that I find very human. Because when he gave the lectures on practical Vedanta in London, he says, I eat meat. I know it's wrong, but I eat it. And why does he eat it? You know, it's clear he eats it because it's almost like a medicine. He is so taken up with this fear of being bloodless, unable to respond, that he says, I teach meat eating across the length and breadth of India because you need your strength. You need to transgress custom because the situation is dangerous. That's what he's saying. And you know, in Gandhi's autobiography, we'll never think of Gandhi as a meat eater, would we? No. But you know, there's that whole discussion of Gandhi being given meat and experimenting with it, and the goat that he feels is bleating within him. And that of course, it's a Muslim who gives him the meat. In that one, but what's happening is this question of meat eating is so strong. They're going to Chicago, the great butcher house of the world. I mean, this is where the stockyards are. And all the Buddhists and the Hindus are appalled by the butchery. So they have not only the materialism, they have this excess of meat eating. So it really is quite shocking, I think, and important to realize that they're confronting something about their own heritage, but also the willingness of these people to just be bloody, you know? And when there's a famous reminiscence by a Smith graduate, a Smith student, and she talks about the blood of Christ. And it really, she never liked that. And he always found the discussion of the blood of Christ very troubling. And he tells, that's the bridge for their discussion. He doesn't talk about that publicly, but it explains many things about, they're talking about things that are so profound from their childhoods, eating, worshiping, you know, thinking about religion, thinking about spirituality, and his willingness to actually step aside is very, very extraordinary to these people who are querying their own backgrounds.
Right.
That's why he touches a nerve.
Ruth,
Yeah.
unbelievably, we are out of time.
Yeah. I enjoy it so much. I could go on forever.
And we have so much more to talk about. But hopefully, and I apologize to everyone in the audience who had a question to whom we couldn't speak. But first of all, thank you everyone for being here. Thank you to our publishers. Ruth, thank you for a wonderful lecture. And Ruth, thank you in advance for signing books outside, which you will do shortly. I urge everyone to make their way out there so that you can talk to Ruth directly. Thank you very much. It's been wonderful.